Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Beaufort County, South Carolina. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1857, the sprawling plantation known as Ashwood Manor stretched across 3,000 acres of South Carolina low country, its boundaries marked by ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss that seemed to whisper secrets to anyone who dared listen too closely. The main house, a Georgian colonial structure with 4 imposing columns, stood like a monument to wealth built on human suffering, its white walls gleaming against the backdrop of endless cotton fields, where dozens of enslaved people toiled from dawn until dusk. The plantation records, discovered in 1962 during the renovation of the old Beaufort County Courthouse, contained meticulous entries detailing every aspect of life at Ashwood Manor. Among these yellowed documents, investigators found a series of entries that painted a disturbing picture of what transpired during the winter months of 1857 and 1858. The handwriting, identified by historical experts as belonging to the plantation overseer, chronicled events that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about antebellum plantation society. If you're enjoying the story and feel like helping the channel with any amount, please support us by clicking the thanks button and donating whatever you wish. This really helps the channel keep posting new stories. Thaddeus Morrison, the plantation owner, was described in contemporary accounts as a man of enormous physical presence. At 43 years old, he weighed well over 300 pounds and required specially constructed furniture to accommodate his massive frame. Local newspaper advertisements from the period show he frequently ordered custom-made clothing from Charleston tailors, often specifying measurements that seemed almost impossible for a human being. Morrison had inherited Ashwood Manor from his father in 1849 and had since transformed it into one of the most profitable cotton operations in the region. The overseer's records describe Morrison as a man who rarely left his study on the second floor of the main house, preferring to conduct plantation business through intermediaries. Visitors to Ashwood Manor often commented on the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to permeate the property, noting how even the house slaves moved with an unusual caution, their eyes downcast and their voices barely above whispers. One entry, dated November 15th, 1857, mentions that Morrison had been experiencing what the overseer diplomatically termed difficulties with his constitution, requiring the services of a physician from Charleston on multiple occasions. Among the enslaved population at Ashwood Manor was a young woman whose beauty had become legendary throughout the Low Country. The plantation records identify her as Celeste, though her original name before enslavement remains unknown. Born around 1835, she'd been purchased by Morrison's father in 1852 from a slave trader in Savannah. Contemporary descriptions, found in letters written by plantation visitors, describe her as possessing an otherworldly beauty that seemed to unnerve even the most hardened overseers. Celeste worked primarily in the main house, serving as a seamstress and occasional lady's maid, though Morrison had never married and therefore had no wife requiring such services. The overseer's notes indicate she was literate, an unusual and technically illegal skill for an enslaved person in South Carolina at the time. Several entries mention finding her reading discarded newspapers and books, though no disciplinary action appears to have been taken against her, which was highly unusual given the strict laws prohibiting enslaved people from learning to read. The social fabric of plantation society in 1857 was built upon a complex web of relationships, dependencies, and unspoken rules that governed every interaction between enslaved and enslaver. Visitors to low-country plantations often remarked on the strange atmosphere that seemed to exist in these isolated communities, where wealth and brutality coexisted in ways that challenged the sensibilities of even those accustomed to the peculiarities of Southern society. On the evening of December 3rd, 1857, Morrison hosted what the overseer's records describe as one of his customary gatherings. These events, held monthly during the social season, brought together plantation owners from across Beaufort County for evenings of cards, drinking, and what contemporary accounts euphemistically called entertainment. The guest list for that particular evening included 7 prominent planters, their names carefully recorded in the overseer's meticulous handwriting. Among the guests was Colonel James Whitfield, owner of the adjacent Magnolia Grove plantation, a man known throughout the region for his gambling habits and volatile temper. Also present was Dr. Cornelius Ashby, whose plantation specialized in rice cultivation along the coastal marshes, and who served as the unofficial physician for several neighboring properties. The records indicate that these men often gathered to discuss business matters, share news from Charleston, and engage in card games that sometimes lasted well into the early morning hours. The overseer's entry for December 3rd contains an unusual level of detail regarding the evening's events, suggesting that something occurred that night which warranted careful documentation. The account describes how the men gathered in Morrison's study after dinner, a room that visitors often noted for its oppressive atmosphere and the peculiar collection of artifacts Morrison had accumulated over the years. Among these were what appeared to be religious items from various African traditions, objects that no respectable plantation owner should have possessed, let alone displayed openly. As the evening progressed, the conversation turned, as it often did, to the subject of their human property. The men discussed recent purchases, the productivity of their workers, and strategies for maintaining discipline among the enslaved population. It was during this conversation that Colonel Whitfield made what the overseer describes as an observation regarding the unusual beauty of the Morrison house slave. This comment, seemingly innocent, would prove to be the catalyst for events that would haunt Ashwood Manor for generations. Morrison's response to Whitfield's observation was recorded with particular attention to detail. The overseer noted that the plantation owner's demeanor changed markedly, his face reddening and his breathing becoming labored. When Whitfield suggested that such beauty was wasted on house duties, Morrison's reaction was swift and unexpected. He challenged Whitfield to a game of cards, with stakes that would have been considered extraordinary even among men accustomed to high-stakes gambling. The terms of the wager, as recorded in the overseer's careful script, were simple yet shocking. If Morrison won the game, Whitfield would pay him $5,000, a sum equivalent to the price of 20 prime field hands. If Whitfield won, he would have the right to choose any enslaved person from Morrison's property to take back to Magnolia Grove. The other guests attempted to dissuade both men from such a reckless wager, but their protests fell on deaf ears. What happened next defied every social convention and legal precedent of the antebellum South. Whitfield won the card game, but instead of selecting an enslaved person to take to his own plantation, he made a counteroffer that stunned everyone present. He proposed that Morrison free Celeste and marry her, or forfeit ownership of 100 acres of prime cotton land along the river. The overseer's account describes the room falling completely silent, with several guests reportedly shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. Morrison's acceptance of these modified terms was recorded without editorial comment, though the overseer's handwriting becomes noticeably less steady in the entries that follow. The plantation owner agreed to the arrangement, though the legal implications were staggering. Interracial marriage was strictly prohibited by South Carolina law, and freeing an enslaved person required extensive legal documentation and approval from the state legislature. Yet Morrison seemed determined to proceed, perhaps driven by motivations that remain unclear even today. The weeks following the card game saw a flurry of unusual activity at Ashwood Manor. The overseer's records document several trips to Charleston, where Morrison met with lawyers, clerks, and various officials whose names appear repeatedly in the documentation. One entry mentions a meeting with a gentleman from Massachusetts, whose presence at a South Carolina plantation would have raised eyebrows under any circumstances, but whose identity remains frustratingly vague in the surviving records. During this period, Celeste's daily routine changed dramatically. Instead of working in the house, she was relocated to a small cabin near the main residence, a building that had previously served as quarters for the plantation's head driver. The overseer notes that she was no longer required to perform any labor, though she remained technically enslaved until the legal paperwork could be completed. This liminal state created an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that affected the entire plantation community. The enslaved population at Ashwood Manor reacted to these developments with what the overseer describes as unusual quietude. Conversations ceased whenever white overseers approached, and the normal rhythms of plantation life seemed disrupted by an undercurrent of apprehension. Several entries mention finding groups of enslaved people engaged in what appeared to be prayer or ritual activities, though the overseer admits he could not understand the languages being spoken. On January 15, 1858, Morrison's lawyers successfully completed the legal maneuvers necessary to free Celeste from bondage. The documentation, preserved in the South Carolina State Archives, shows that Morrison paid substantial fees and provided guarantees that she would not become a burden on the state. The papers also included what appeared to be a fabricated genealogy, claiming she was of mixed European and Native American heritage, rather than African, a legal fiction necessary to circumvent South Carolina's strict racial classification laws. The marriage ceremony, such as it was, took place on January 22, 1858, in the drawing room of Ashwood Manor. The overseer's account of the event is notably sparse, mentioning only that Dr. Ashby performed the ceremony in his capacity as a justice of the peace, and that no other guests were present. What the record does not explicitly state, but strongly implies, is that this union violated every social, legal and moral standard of antebellum Southern society. The immediate aftermath of the marriage saw dramatic changes in the operation of Ashwood Manor. Morrison, who had previously maintained strict oversight of plantation activities, began delegating most responsibilities to his overseer and the head driver. His daily routine shifted from early morning inspections of the fields to long periods spent in his study, emerging only for meals and brief conversations with visitors who came on business matters. Celeste, now legally free and bearing the Morrison name, occupied an impossible social position. She was neither white nor enslaved, neither guest nor servant, existing in a space that antebellum society had no framework to understand or accommodate. The overseer's records indicate she spent most of her time in the main house, though her specific activities remain unclear. Visitors to the plantation during this period often commented on the strange atmosphere that pervaded the property, though none dared to inquire directly about the circumstances of Morrison's marriage. The reaction of the broader community to Morrison's marriage was swift and severe. Within weeks of the ceremony, several neighboring planters severed business relationships with Ashwood Manor. The overseer's correspondence files contain numerous letters from former associates expressing their disapproval and their intention to cease all social and commercial interactions with Morrison. One letter, from a prominent Charleston cotton factor, explicitly states that he would no longer handle Morrison's crop, effectively cutting off access to crucial markets. Dr. Ashby, who had performed the marriage ceremony, found himself similarly ostracized by local society. His medical practice, which had previously served the elite families of Beaufort County, saw a dramatic decline as former patients sought treatment elsewhere. The social isolation extended to their families, with wives and children of prominent planters no longer welcome at gatherings where the Ashbys might be present. During the spring of 1858, strange reports began to emerge from Ashwood Manor. Workers in the fields claimed to hear sounds emanating from the main house at odd hours, descriptions that varied from crying to what sounded like furniture being moved across floors. The overseer's notes from this period become increasingly cryptic, with several entries mentioning disturbances without providing specific details about their nature or cause. One particularly unsettling entry, dated April 8, 1858, describes an incident where field workers reported seeing lights in the windows of the main house during a severe thunderstorm. When the overseer investigated the following morning, he found evidence that someone had been moving through the house during the night, though both Morrison and his wife claimed to have been asleep in their respective bedrooms since early evening. The entry concludes with the ominous observation that the house itself seems to resist this union. D. The enslaved community at Ashwood Manor began displaying behaviors that concerned the overseer and the few remaining white employees. Work songs, which had previously been a constant soundtrack to plantation life, gradually ceased. Instead, workers moved through their daily tasks in an eerie silence broken only by whispered conversations in languages the overseer could not identify. Several entries mention finding makeshift altars or shrines hidden in slave quarters, constructed from materials that included bones, shells, and plants that did not grow naturally in the area. By summer, the financial situation at Ashwood Manor had deteriorated significantly. Without access to traditional markets and with several key business relationships severed, Morrison struggled to sell his cotton crop. The overseer's accounting records show a steady decline in revenue, while expenses continued to mount. Repairs to buildings and equipment were deferred, and the number of enslaved workers was reduced through sales to distant plantations, though these transactions brought in far less money than Morrison had hoped. The isolation of Ashwood Manor became increasingly complete as the months passed. Mail delivery, which had previously been reliable, became sporadic, with some letters taking weeks to reach their destinations. Suppliers who had once competed for Morrison's business now claimed to be unable to fulfill orders, citing various logistical difficulties that seemed to affect only deliveries to the plantation. Even the local church, where Morrison had been a regular attendee and substantial financial contributor, began finding reasons to exclude him from congregation activities. Celeste's own experience during this period remains largely undocumented, as neither she nor Morrison left detailed personal accounts of their daily life. However, fragmentary evidence suggests she was acutely aware of her precarious position. A letter discovered in 1963, apparently written by her to an unknown recipient but never sent, describes feeling suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The letter, authenticated by handwriting experts, provides one of the few direct insights into her thoughts during this tumultuous period. As autumn approached, the overseer's entries take on an increasingly urgent tone. He documents several instances of what he terms night disturbances, including unexplained sounds from the direction of the slave quarters and reports from field hands of strange lights moving through the cotton fields after dark. One entry describes finding evidence that someone had been digging in the family cemetery, though no graves appeared to have been disturbed and nothing seemed to be missing. The breaking point came on the evening of October 13th, 1858, The overseer's account of that night is fragmentary and difficult to interpret, but it appears that some kind of confrontation occurred between Morrison and several members of the enslaved community. The entry mentions raised voices, sounds of struggle, and the discovery the following morning of what appeared to be bloodstains on the front porch of the main house, though these had been cleaned away before any formal investigation could be conducted. In the days following this incident, the overseer noted a dramatic change in Morrison's behavior. The plantation owner, who had always been somewhat reclusive, now rarely left his study and refused to meet with visitors. His physical appearance deteriorated rapidly, with those who did see him commenting on his pallor and apparent weight loss, remarkable changes for a man of his substantial size. Dr. Ashby was summoned several times, but his notes from these visits were cryptic and uninformative. Celeste's behavior during this period also became increasingly erratic. The overseer's records indicate she began taking long walks through the plantation at all hours, often returning to the house with dirt on her clothes and what appeared to be plant materials in her hair. On several occasions, field workers reported seeing her standing motionless in the cotton fields, staring toward the slave quarters with an expression they described as unnatural. The final entry in the overseer's journal is dated November 2nd, 1858. It simply states, "The arrangement has reached its conclusion. Mr. Morrison has departed for Charleston on business. Mrs. Morrison remains at the plantation. I have submitted my resignation and will be leaving Ashwood Manor at the end of this week. God help whoever comes next." What exactly transpired at Ashwood Manor in the weeks following the overseer's departure remains unclear. The plantation's operation continued under the supervision of the head driver, though documentary evidence from this period is scarce. County records show that Morrison returned from Charleston in mid-November, but there are no further personal accounts or business correspondence from him after that date. The winter of 1858 to 1859 was particularly harsh in the Low Country, with unusually cold temperatures and several severe storms that damaged buildings and disrupted transportation throughout the region. Ashwood Manor, already isolated by social ostracism, became even more cut off from the outside world. Supply deliveries ceased entirely, and mail service was suspended until spring due to impassable roads. When contact with the outside world resumed in March of 1859, neighboring planters noticed that Ashwood Manor had fallen into a state of apparent abandonment. Fields that should have been prepared for spring planting remained untouched, and smoke was no longer visible from the chimneys of the main house. Several enslaved people from neighboring plantations reported seeing no signs of life at the property, though they claimed to hear strange sounds emanating from the direction of the main house during the night. Dr. Ashby, perhaps feeling some responsibility for the situation he had helped create, finally ventured to Ashwood Manor in early April. His account of what he found there, preserved in a letter to his brother in Virginia, is both brief and deeply unsettling. He describes finding the main house apparently empty, with furniture overturned and what appeared to be symbols carved into the wooden floors of several rooms. Most disturbing of all, he reported finding evidence that someone had been living in the house recently, though he encountered no human inhabitants during his visit. The mystery deepened when county officials conducted a formal investigation later that month. They found Morrison's body in his study, apparently dead for several weeks from what the coroner determined to be natural causes related to his obesity and poor health. However, Celeste was nowhere to be found, despite extensive searches of the plantation grounds and surrounding areas. Her personal belongings remained in the house, and there was no evidence she had departed voluntarily or been removed by force. The enslaved population of Ashwood Manor had also vanished without explanation. The overseer's records indicated that at least 43 people had been living on the property, but the investigating officials found no trace of any of them. The slave quarters stood empty, with personal belongings left behind as if their occupants had simply disappeared overnight. Most puzzling of all, there was no evidence of violence or struggle anywhere on the property. Legal proceedings to settle Morrison's estate proved complicated and contentious. With no will and no clear heir, the property fell into probate court, where it remained tied up in legal disputes for over 2 years. During this period, the plantation house and outbuildings fell into serious disrepair, and the fields were gradually reclaimed by forest. Several attempts were made to sell the property, but potential buyers invariably withdrew their offers after visiting the site, citing vague concerns about the atmosphere of the place. In 1861, as South Carolina prepared for war, a group of investors from Charleston finally purchased Ashwood Manor at a fraction of its previous value. They intended to restore the plantation to working order and resume cotton production, but their plans were soon disrupted by the Civil War. The property was abandoned once again, and by war's end, the main house had been severely damaged by exposure to the elements and occasional occupation by both Confederate and Union forces. The post-war period brought new owners to Ashwood Manor, but none remained for long. A family from Massachusetts purchased the property in 1868, intending to establish a school for freed slaves, but they departed abruptly after less than 6 months, claiming the location was unsuitable for their purposes. Subsequent owners included a cotton factor from New Orleans who lasted 8 months, a rice planter from Georgetown who departed after a single season, and a timber company that abandoned their operations after numerous equipment failures and worker complaints. Local folklore regarding Ashwood Manor began to develop during the 1870s, with stories circulating about unexplained lights, strange sounds, and apparitions seen on the property. Former enslaved people from neighboring plantations contributed to these tales, though their accounts were often dismissed by white residents who preferred to forget the uncomfortable history of Morrison's marriage and its aftermath. One persistent element in these folk accounts was the claim that Celeste had never truly left Ashwood Manor. Witnesses reported seeing a woman matching her description walking through the ruins of the plantation house, particularly during the early morning hours before dawn. These sightings became so common that the property gained a reputation for being haunted, further discouraging potential buyers or tenants. In 1885, a journalist from the Charleston News and Courier investigated the Ashwood Manor story as part of a series on abandoned plantations of the Low Country. His article, published in 3 installments, was the first serious attempt to document the events of 1857 and 58. However, many of the people he interviewed were reluctant to discuss the matter in detail, and key documents had already been lost or destroyed in the chaos of reconstruction. The journalist did succeed in tracking down Dr. Ashby, by then an elderly man living in retirement near Columbia. Ashby's recollections, published in the newspaper, provided some additional details about Morrison's final months, but he remained evasive about the specific circumstances of the marriage and its aftermath. When pressed about Celeste's disappearance, he would only say that some unions are not meant to be, and that the natural order has ways of reasserting itself. By the turn of the 20th century, Ashwood Manor had achieved a kind of notorious fame throughout South Carolina. The ruins of the main house, partially collapsed and overgrown with vegetation, became a destination for curiosity seekers and amateur historians. Several academic researchers attempted to study the site, but their work was hampered by the deteriorated condition of the buildings and the lack of comprehensive documentation from the plantation period. In 1912, the South Carolina Historical Society commissioned a formal archaeological survey of Ashwood Manor. The researchers uncovered numerous artifacts from the plantation period, including household items, farming tools, and personal possessions that had apparently been abandoned when the site was evacuated. However, they also found evidence of activities that were harder to explain, including what appeared to be ritual sites in the former slave quarters and strange symbols carved into trees throughout the property. The archaeological team's final report, published in 1914, raised more questions than it answered. The researchers noted numerous anomalies in the physical evidence, including the absence of any graves in the slave cemetery, despite documentary evidence that several people had died at the plantation during the 1850s. They also found evidence of extensive digging throughout the property, though the purpose and timing of this excavation work remained unclear. World War I brought renewed attention to abandoned properties throughout South Carolina, as the state government sought to inventory land that could potentially be put to productive use. Ashwood Manor was surveyed once again, and the report noted that the property showed signs of recent habitation, despite having no official residence for over 50 years. Investigators found evidence of temporary camps, recently used fire pits, and food remnants that suggested people had been living on the land intermittently. During the 1920s, several attempts were made to develop Ashwood Manor for commercial purposes. A lumber company harvested timber from the forested portions of the property, but their operations were plagued by equipment failures and worker injuries that seemed to exceed normal expectations. A developer proposed building a resort hotel on the site, but his plans were abandoned after preliminary work revealed what he described as unsuitable soil conditions. The Great Depression brought new hardships to rural South Carolina, and Ashwood Manor once again became a refuge for people with nowhere else to go. Homeless families constructed makeshift shelters among the ruins, and transient workers established temporary camps while seeking employment in nearby towns. However, these informal settlements rarely lasted more than a few weeks, with residents departing abruptly and often leaving their belongings behind. Local authorities began to notice patterns in the complaints they received about Ashwood Manor during this period. People reported feeling unwell after spending time on the property, with symptoms including nausea, headaches, and what several described as a feeling of being watched. Whereas more disturbing were reports of people becoming disoriented or losing track of time while on the property, sometimes disappearing for hours with no memory of where they had been. In 1935, a team of researchers from the University of South Carolina conducted what they described as a paranormal investigation of Ashwood Manor. Their methods would not be considered scientific by modern standards, but their report documented numerous unexplained phenomena, including temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic anomalies, and what they termed auditory hallucinations. The team's leader, Professor Harold Whitman, concluded that the property exhibited characteristics consistent with psychic residue from traumatic past events. The outbreak of World War II brought temporary stability to Ashwood Manor, as the federal government designated the property as a training site for military exercises. Soldiers conducted maneuvers among the ruins and used the open fields for artillery practice. However, the military's use of the site was brief, lasting only 6 months before operations were transferred to a different location. Official records cite logistical difficulties, but informal accounts from veterans suggest there were other reasons for the relocation. The post-war period saw renewed interest in the historical significance of Ashwood Manor. In 1949, the plantation was designated as a historic site by the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, though this designation was largely symbolic given the deteriorated condition of the remaining structures. Plans to restore the main house were developed but never implemented due to cost concerns and ongoing questions about the property's ownership. During the 1950s, several academic studies examined the Ashwood Manor case as part of broader research into the social dynamics of antebellum plantation society. These scholars were particularly interested in Morrison's marriage as an example of how individual actions could disrupt established social hierarchies. However, their work was limited by the incomplete documentary record and the reluctance of local residents to discuss the matter in detail. In 1962, Hurricane Donna caused significant additional damage to the ruins at Ashwood Manor. The storm toppled what remained of the main house's walls and scattered debris across the property. Cleanup efforts revealed additional artifacts and documents that had been preserved in hidden spaces within the structure. Among these finds was a cache of letters in what appeared to be Celeste's handwriting, though their authenticity could not be definitively established. The discovery of these letters generated renewed interest in the Ashwood Manor story. The documents suggested that Celeste had maintained correspondence with unknown recipients well into 1859, months after her supposed disappearance. The letters described a state of existence that was neither life nor death, a liminal condition that defied easy categorization. However, experts who examined the documents noted inconsistencies in the paper and ink that raised questions about when they had actually been written. By the 1960s, Ashwood Manor had achieved a kind of equilibrium as a site of historical curiosity and occasional academic interest. The property remained in government ownership, with access restricted but not entirely prohibited. Graduate students and researchers continued to visit the site, though few stayed long enough to conduct comprehensive studies. The consensus among scholars was that while the historical facts of Morrison's marriage were well documented, the circumstances surrounding its aftermath would likely remain forever mysterious. The civil rights movement brought new perspectives to the story of Ashwood Manor. African-American scholars and activists began to examine the case as an example of how enslaved people had been used as pawns in the conflicts and obsessions of their white owners. They argued that Celeste's story illustrated the complex ways in which enslaved women navigated systems of oppression, even when those systems appeared to offer unexpected opportunities for freedom. In 1968, exactly 110 years after Morrison's death, a final attempt was made to solve the mystery of what had happened at Ashwood Manor. A team of investigators that included historians, archaeologists, and forensic experts conducted the most thorough examination of the site that had ever been attempted. They used ground-penetrating radar to search for unmarked graves, analyzed soil samples for chemical anomalies, and conducted extensive interviews with elderly residents who might have preserved oral histories about the plantation. The 1968 investigation produced mixed results. The team did locate what appeared to be unmarked graves in areas of the property that had not previously been searched, though the remains they discovered were too deteriorated to provide useful information about identity or cause of death. They also found evidence of structures that did not appear on any historical maps of the plantation, including what seemed to be underground chambers beneath the slave quarters. More intriguingly, the investigators documented numerous accounts from local residents about ongoing unexplained phenomena at Ashwood Manor. These stories, collected from people with no apparent connection to each other, showed remarkable consistency in their details. Witnesses described seeing lights moving through the ruins on moonless nights, hearing voices speaking in unknown languages, and encountering a woman in antebellum dress who would disappear when approached. The final report of the 1968 investigation was never officially published. Team members cited disagreements about methodology and conclusions, though rumors persisted that they had discovered evidence they were not prepared to make public. The project's leader, Dr. Margaret Thornton of the College of Charleston, would only say that some historical mysteries are perhaps better left unsolved, and that the past has ways of protecting its secrets. Today, more than 160 years after the events that made it infamous, Ashwood Manor remains an abandoned ruin in the South Carolina Lowcountry. The property is closed to public access, though determined visitors sometimes find ways to reach the site despite posted warnings and security measures. The ruins themselves are barely recognizable as having once been human habitation, with only foundation stones and a few remaining walls marking where the Grand Plantation House once stood. Local real estate agents report that the property occasionally attracts potential buyers, particularly developers interested in the waterfront acreage along the river. However, these inquiries rarely progress beyond initial site visits. Prospective purchasers consistently cite practical concerns about development costs and environmental regulations, though some admit to feeling uncomfortable on the property for reasons they cannot easily articulate. The story of Morrison, Celeste, and Ashwood Manor has found new life in the digital age, with numerous websites, podcasts, and online forums dedicated to discussing the case. Modern investigators armed with sophisticated equipment have attempted to document paranormal activity at the site, though their results have been no more conclusive than those of their predecessors. The property continues to generate reports of unexplained phenomena, though these are now as likely to be shared on social media as reported to local authorities. Recent genealogical research has traced the descendants of some of the enslaved people who lived at Ashwood Manor before its abandonment. These family histories, preserved through oral tradition and recently discovered documents, provide additional context for understanding the complex social dynamics that existed on the plantation. However, they also raise new questions about what happened to the 43 people who disappeared without explanation in 1858. One particularly intriguing development has been the discovery of similar cases from other plantations in South Carolina and Georgia during the same historical period. Researchers have identified at least 6 other instances of plantation owners entering into irregular marriages or relationships that violated social norms, and in each case, the properties involved were subsequently abandoned under mysterious circumstances. This pattern suggests that Morrison's marriage to Celeste may have been part of a broader phenomenon that historians are only beginning to understand. Climate change and rising sea levels now threaten what remains of Ashwood Manor. The property sits in an area that is increasingly subject to flooding, and saltwater intrusion is affecting the soil chemistry in ways that may accelerate the decay of any remaining artifacts. Environmental scientists predict that within 50 years, much of the site may be permanently underwater, finally completing the process of erasure that began more than a century ago. The legal status of Ashwood Manor remains complicated, with multiple government agencies claiming jurisdiction over different aspects of the property. Environmental regulators monitor the site for contamination, historic preservation officials maintain its protected status, and law enforcement agencies periodically patrol to deter trespassers. However, these overlapping authorities have resulted in a lack of coordinated management, and the property continues to deteriorate despite its official protection. For the residents of Beaufort County, Ashwood Manor serves as a reminder of their region's complex and often troubling history. Local schools include the plantation story in their curriculum about antebellum society and the experiences of enslaved people, though teachers report that students often focus more on the mysterious circumstances surrounding the property's abandonment than on its historical significance. The site has become a kind of local legend, passed down through families and embellished with each retelling. Recent archaeological surveys conducted as part of climate change impact studies have revealed that significant portions of the original plantation infrastructure remain buried beneath decades of accumulated sediment and vegetation. Ground-penetrating radar has identified what appear to be complete building foundations, roadways, and even sections of the original slave quarters that were thought to have been completely destroyed. These discoveries suggest that a more complete picture of life at Ashwood Manor may yet be recoverable, though the cost and complexity of such an excavation would be enormous. The question of what really happened to Celeste continues to captivate researchers and amateur investigators. Her legal freedom, documented in official records, should have provided her with options for starting a new life elsewhere. Yet there is no evidence she ever left the plantation or attempted to establish herself in another community. The letters found in 1962, if authentic, suggest she remained at Ashwood Manor well after Morrison's death. But their cryptic content raises more questions than it answers. Some scholars have proposed that Celeste's disappearance was actually an escape, facilitated by networks of free people of color or abolitionists who helped her establish a new identity in the North or West. This theory would explain the lack of evidence regarding her fate, as successful escapes often required the complete abandonment of previous identities. However, critics argue that such networks were less developed in 1858 than they would become later, and that a woman of Celeste's distinctive appearance would have found it difficult to disappear completely. Alternative theories focus on the possibility that Celeste never intended to leave Ashwood Manor, viewing the property as her rightful home despite its troubled history. According to this interpretation, she may have remained on the plantation after Morrison's death, living in hidden areas of the property and maintaining the spiritual practices that the archaeological evidence suggests were important to the enslaved community. Her disappearance from official records would then reflect not an escape or death, but a conscious decision to exist outside the structures of documented society. The economic impact of the Ashwood Manor case extended far beyond the immediate plantation community. Morrison's social ostracism and subsequent business failures contributed to a broader pattern of economic instability in Beaufort County during the late 1850s. Several other planters who had been closely associated with Morrison also experienced financial difficulties, though whether this was due to direct retaliation or simple guilt by association remains unclear. The marriage also had legal implications that extended well beyond South Carolina. News of Morrison's union with a formerly enslaved woman reached other southern states and prompted discussions about the adequacy of existing laws governing interracial relationships. Several states strengthened their anti-miscegenation statutes in direct response to the Ashwood Manor case, while Northern abolitionists used the story as evidence of the moral corruption inherent in the slavery system. Religious communities throughout the region were deeply divided by the Morrison marriage. Some ministers condemned it as a violation of divine law, while others argued that Morrison's decision to free and marry Celeste demonstrated a recognition of her humanity that was consistent with Christian principles. The controversy contributed to existing tensions within denominations and may have influenced the church divisions that would become more pronounced during the Civil War. The medical aspects of Morrison's final months have attracted attention from researchers interested in the relationship between psychological stress and physical health. Contemporary accounts suggest that his isolation and the social pressure he experienced contributed to a rapid decline in his already fragile health. Modern medical experts who have examined the available evidence suggest he may have suffered from what would now be recognized as depression or anxiety disorders, conditions that could have exacerbated his existing physical ailments. Dr. Ashby's role in facilitating the marriage has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate. As both the officiant and a medical professional, he would have been uniquely positioned to understand the potential consequences of Morrison's decision. Some historians argue that Ashby acted out of genuine belief in the righteousness of Morrison's cause, while others suggest he may have been coerced or manipulated into participation. His own subsequent social ostracism and professional ruin indicate that he paid a heavy price for his involvement, regardless of his motivations. The enslaved community's reaction to Morrison's marriage remains one of the most intriguing aspects of the entire case. The overseers' records suggest that they viewed the union with a mixture of hope and apprehension, recognizing it as both a potential precedent for their own liberation and a dangerous disruption of the established order that might provoke violent retaliation. The spiritual practices that archaeological evidence suggests became more prominent during this period may have represented attempts to influence or protect against the unpredictable forces that Morrison's actions had unleashed. In 1869, 11 years after the events at Ashwood Manor, a remarkable document surfaced in the archives of a Charleston law firm. The papers, discovered during the settlement of the firm's founding partner's estate, included what appeared to be a detailed confession written by Morrison in the weeks before his death. The document, whose authenticity was immediately questioned, described his marriage to Celeste as part of a larger plan to atone for what he called generations of sin committed by his family against their enslaved workers. According to this alleged confession, Morrison had become convinced that his family's wealth was cursed, and that only through a complete reversal of the social order could he hope to achieve redemption. The marriage to Celeste was described not as the result of a card game, but as a carefully planned act of penance designed to shock Southern society into confronting the moral contradictions of slavery. However, legal experts who examined the document noted several inconsistencies in language and legal terminology that suggested it might have been composed much later than its purported date. The confession also contained disturbing allegations about the treatment of enslaved people at Ashwood Manor during the years before Morrison inherited the property. It described systematic abuses committed by his father and overseers, including medical experiments, forced breeding programs, and ritualistic punishments that went far beyond the already brutal norms of plantation discipline. If true, these revelations would help explain the atmosphere of fear and spiritual resistance that seemed to permeate the plantation community even after conditions had supposedly improved under Morrison's management. More controversially, the confession suggested that Celeste had not been a passive victim of circumstances, but an active participant in Morrison's plan for moral reformation. According to this account, she had used her literacy and intelligence to help Morrison understand the true scope of the injustices committed on the plantation, and had guided him toward the radical decision to challenge social conventions through their marriage. This portrayal of Celeste as a strategic actor, rather than a victim, represented a significant departure from contemporary assumptions about the agency available to enslaved women. The final portions of the alleged confession described Morrison's growing realization that his actions had unleashed forces beyond his control or understanding. He wrote of strange occurrences that began shortly after the marriage, including voices speaking in languages he did not recognize, objects moving without explanation, and the appearance of symbols carved into surfaces throughout the house. Most disturbing of all, he described a growing conviction that Celeste was somehow connected to these phenomena, and that his marriage had bound him to spiritual forces that predated his family's arrival in South Carolina. Professional historians who examined the confession were divided about its authenticity. The document's discovery in a reputable law firm's archives lent it some credibility, but the sensational nature of its contents and the convenient timing of its appearance raised significant questions. Some scholars argued that even if the confession was not genuine, it might have been based on authentic oral traditions that preserved accurate information about conditions at Ashwood Manor. Others dismissed it entirely as a hoax designed to capitalize on growing public interest in plantation history. The Confessions publication in a Charleston newspaper in 1870 sparked renewed controversy about the Ashwood Manor case. Former neighbors and business associates of Morrison came forward with their own recollections, some supporting the Confessions' claims about his state of mind during his final months, while others vehemently denied that he could have harbored such radical beliefs about slavery and social justice. The debate reflected broader tensions in post-Civil War South Carolina about how to remember and interpret the antebellum period. One of the most significant contributions to understanding the Ashwood Manor case came from an unexpected source in 1872. Sarah Collins, a formerly enslaved woman who had worked as a seamstress at neighboring Magnolia Grove Plantation, provided testimony to a federal investigator that shed new light on the events of 1857 and 58. Collins, who had been friends with Celeste before Morrison's marriage, claimed to have maintained contact with her even after the social isolation of Ashwood Manor began. According to Collins, Celeste had confided that the marriage was part of a larger plan developed by the enslaved community at Ashwood Manor to gain control over the plantation's operations. This plan allegedly involved using Morrison's obvious infatuation with Celeste to manipulate him into making increasingly radical decisions that would ultimately lead to the liberation of all enslaved people on the property. The card game and subsequent marriage were described not as random events, but as carefully orchestrated steps in a campaign that had been developing for months. Collins also provided details about the spiritual practices that had become prominent among the enslaved community during the period leading up to Morrison's marriage. She described elaborate rituals conducted in secret locations throughout the plantation, involving the use of herbs, symbols, and incantations designed to influence the thoughts and actions of white overseers and owners. These practices, which Collins claimed were based on traditions brought from Africa and adapted to American conditions, were said to have given the enslaved community a sense of agency and power despite their legal subjugation. Most remarkably, Collins claimed to have seen Celeste several times after her supposed disappearance, describing encounters that took place in the woods between the two plantations during the early 1860s. According to these accounts, Celeste had not died or escaped, but had assumed a new role as a spiritual leader for the broader enslaved community in Beaufort County. She was said to have continued living on or near Ashwood Manor, using hidden shelters and relying on support from people throughout the region who brought her food and supplies. The credibility of Collins's testimony was immediately questioned by white residents of Beaufort County, who dismissed her claims as fantasy or deliberate deception. However, other formerly enslaved people came forward with similar stories, describing a network of spiritual practices and mutual aid that had operated largely invisible to white observation throughout the antebellum and Civil War periods. These accounts suggested that the enslaved community had maintained far greater autonomy and organization than their owners had realized. Federal investigators took Collins's testimony seriously enough to conduct additional searches of the Ashwood Manor property in 1873. This investigation, led by agents from the Freedmen's Bureau, uncovered evidence of concealed living spaces in various locations throughout the plantation, including elaborate hiding places that could have sheltered someone for extended periods. They also found what appeared to be a sophisticated communication system using marked trees, arranged stones, and other natural features to convey information across long distances. The 1873 investigation also documented extensive evidence of the spiritual practices Collins had described. Investigators found numerous ritual sites throughout the plantation, including areas where the soil showed chemical evidence of repeated ceremonial burning, and locations where unusual artifacts had been buried or cached. Analysis of these materials revealed a complex blend of African traditions, Native American influences, and Christian symbolism that suggested a highly developed spiritual culture operating parallel to the official religious activities overseen by white clergy. Perhaps most significantly, the federal investigation uncovered documentary evidence that supported some of Collins's claims about continued contact with Celeste after 1858. Letters and notes found hidden in various locations throughout the plantation included several that appeared to be in her handwriting, dating from the early 1860s. These documents described a life of hiding and constant movement, but also suggested that she had maintained leadership of spiritual and resistance activities throughout the Civil War period. The revelation that Celeste might have remained in the area for years after her supposed disappearance prompted a major reassessment of the entire Ashwood Manor case. If Collins's testimony was accurate, then the mysterious circumstances surrounding the plantation's abandonment took on entirely different significance. Rather than representing the supernatural consequences of Morrison's transgression against social norms, the events might have been the result of a successful campaign by the enslaved community to claim control over the property and drive away its white occupants. This interpretation suggested that the reports of strange phenomena at Ashwood Manor might have been deliberately created by people who wanted to discourage white settlement or investigation of the area. The unexplained lights, sounds, and apparitions that had been reported for decades could have been the work of people who continued to use the plantation as a base for activities they preferred to keep hidden. The persistent folklore about the property being haunted would then represent a successful strategy for maintaining privacy and autonomy in a hostile environment. However, this rational explanation could not account for all aspects of the Ashwood Manor mystery. Even if some of the reported phenomena had been artificially created, witnesses consistently described experiences that seemed to go beyond simple deception or misdirection. The medical and psychological effects reported by people who spent time on the property were difficult to explain as the result of deliberate human activity, and the consistency of accounts across decades suggested influences that transcended any individual campaign of deception. The economic and social consequences of the Ashwood Manor case continued to reverberate through Beaufort County well into the 20th century. The property's abandonment removed thousands of acres from productive use, affecting tax revenues and employment throughout the region. More subtly, the story of Morrison's marriage and its aftermath contributed to an atmosphere of racial tension and suspicion that influenced social relations long after slavery itself had ended. For the African American community, Ashwood Manor became a symbol of both resistance and tragedy. Some viewed Celeste as a heroic figure who had successfully challenged white supremacy and created space for autonomous black life, while others saw her story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of attempting to work within systems of oppression. These differing interpretations reflected broader debates about strategies for achieving racial justice and equality in the post-Reconstruction South. White residents of Beaufort County generally preferred to forget the Morrison marriage entirely, treating it as an embarrassing aberration that reflected poorly on their region's history. When the story was discussed at all, it was typically framed as evidence of the moral confusion and social chaos that characterized the final years of the antebellum period. This interpretation allowed white residents to distance themselves from Morrison's actions while maintaining their commitment to racial hierarchy and separation. The rise of the modern civil rights movement brought renewed attention to stories like that of Ashwood Manor. Activists and scholars searched historical records for evidence of black resistance and autonomy that had been overlooked or suppressed by previous generations of historians. The possibility that Celeste and the enslaved community at Ashwood Manor had successfully orchestrated Morrison's downfall and claimed control over the plantation made their story particularly appealing to people seeking inspiration from the past. Academic interest in the case peaked during the 1970s and 80s, as historians, influenced by social movement activism, began to examine slavery and plantation society from the perspectives of enslaved people themselves. Several doctoral dissertations and scholarly articles attempted to reconstruct the events at Ashwood Manor using techniques of social history that emphasized the experiences of ordinary people rather than elite white planters. However, the incomplete documentary record and the passage of time made definitive conclusions elusive. Archaeological work conducted during the 1990s provided new insights into daily life at Ashwood Manor, but also raised additional questions about what had happened there. Excavations revealed evidence of activities that did not conform to typical patterns of plantation life, including the remains of structures that seemed designed for concealment rather than efficiency or comfort. Chemical analysis of soil samples indicated the presence of plants and minerals that were not native to South Carolina, suggesting trade connections or cultural practices that extended far beyond the immediate region. Most intriguingly, the archaeological team discovered what appeared to be a complex system of underground passages connecting various buildings on the plantation. These tunnels, some of which extended for hundreds of feet, would have allowed for movement throughout the property without surface observation. The construction of such a system would have required considerable time, planning, and coordinated effort, providing strong evidence for the kind of organized resistance activities that Collins's testimony had described. The tunnel system also offered a plausible explanation for some of the mysterious phenomena that had been reported at Ashwood Manor over the years. Sounds emanating from underground could create the impression of voices or movement without any visible source, while the tunnels themselves could provide hiding places for people who wished to remain undetected on the property. The acoustic properties of the underground spaces might also explain reports of strange echoes or distorted voices that witnesses had described. However, the archaeological team noted features of the tunnel system that were difficult to explain in purely practical terms. Some passages led to chambers that served no apparent functional purpose, while others terminated in areas where the soil composition suggested ritualistic activity. The walls of several tunnels contained carved symbols similar to those found in the plantation's surface ritual sites, indicating that the underground spaces had spiritual as well as practical significance for their creators. Carbon dating of materials found in the tunnels suggested that construction had begun well before Morrison's marriage to Celeste, possibly as early as the 1840s. This timeline indicated that the enslaved community at Ashwood Manor had been planning and preparing for resistance activities for more than a decade before the events that brought national attention to the plantation. The scope and sophistication of their preparations suggested a level of organization and forward thinking that challenged assumptions about the capacity of enslaved people to develop complex strategies for liberation. The 1990s archaeological work also uncovered evidence that supported Collins's claims about Celeste's continued presence in the area after 1858. Personal items that appeared to belong to her were found in several of the hidden chambers, along with documents and other materials that dated from the Civil War period. Most remarkably, one chamber contained what appeared to be a complete living space, furnished with items that suggested long-term habitation by someone of intelligence and education. DNA analysis of hair and other organic materials found at the site provided additional evidence for human occupation of the underground chambers well into the 1860s. While the technology available in the 1990s was not sophisticated enough to definitively identify individuals, the results were consistent with the presence of people of African ancestry who had lived on or near the plantation for extended periods. These findings lent scientific credibility to the oral traditions that had long maintained that Ashwood Manor continued to shelter people after its official abandonment. The revelation that Ashwood Manor had functioned as a center for resistance activities during and after slavery prompted discussions about the property's appropriate commemoration and preservation. Civil rights organizations argued that the site deserved recognition as an important location in the history of black resistance, while some local residents expressed concern about drawing additional attention to events they preferred to forget. These debates reflected ongoing tensions about how American society should remember and interpret its history of racial oppression. In 1998, Ashwood Manor was designated as a National Historic Landmark, recognizing its significance in the history of slavery, resistance, and social change in the antebellum South. The designation provided federal protection for the site and funding for additional research and preservation efforts. However, it also sparked controversy among some local residents who felt that the federal government was imposing outside interpretations on their regional history. The landmark designation led to the establishment of a visitor center and museum that presented the story of Ashwood Manor within the broader context of plantation society and slave resistance. The exhibits attempted to balance historical accuracy with sensitivity to the traumatic nature of the subject matter, using multimedia presentations and interactive displays to help visitors understand the complex social dynamics that had shaped life on the plantation. However, debates continued about how to interpret ambiguous evidence and whether to present contested theories as established fact. Educational programs developed for the Ashwood Manor site emphasized the agency and resistance of enslaved people, rather than focusing solely on their victimization. Students visiting the plantation learned about the sophisticated networks of communication and mutual aid that had operated largely invisible to white observers, and about the ways enslaved people had used cultural and spiritual practices to maintain autonomy and dignity despite legal subjugation. These programs represented a significant departure from traditional plantation tourism, which had often romanticized the antebellum period while minimizing the realities of slavery. The turn of the 21st century brought new technologies and methodologies to the study of Ashwood Manor. Ground-penetrating radar revealed additional underground structures that had not been detected by previous archaeological surveys, while improved DNA analysis techniques allowed for more precise identification of organic materials found at the site. Satellite imagery and geographic information systems mapping provided new insights into the spatial organization of plantation activities and the relationship between Ashwood Manor and surrounding properties. Perhaps most significantly, oral history projects conducted among the descendants of enslaved people from Beaufort County preserved traditions and memories that had been passed down through families for generations. These accounts provided details about daily life, resistance activities, and spiritual practices that were not recorded in any written sources. While the accuracy of such oral traditions could not always be verified, they offered perspectives on plantation society that were entirely absent from the documentary record created by white observers. One particularly valuable oral history was provided by the descendants of Sarah Collins, the woman who had testified about her continued contact with Celeste during the 1870s. Family traditions preserved detailed accounts of the Underground Railroad activities that had operated in Beaufort County before and during the Civil War, including the role that Ashwood Manor had played as a safe house and coordination center. These accounts suggested that the plantation's isolation and mysterious reputation had actually made it an ideal location for clandestine activities. The Collins family traditions also preserved what were claimed to be direct quotes from Celeste, passed down through several generations of oral transmission. These alleged statements described her perspective on the marriage to Morrison and her subsequent life in hiding, portraying her as a complex figure who combined pragmatic political calculation with deep spiritual commitments. While the authenticity of these quotes could not be verified, they provided insights into how enslaved people might have understood and interpreted the extraordinary events that had unfolded at Ashwood Manor. Modern scholarship on the Ashwood Manor case has emphasized the importance of understanding it within the broader context of slave resistance and cultural preservation throughout the Americas. Comparative studies have identified similar patterns of spiritual practice, underground construction, and organized resistance at plantation sites in other regions, suggesting that the activities documented at Ashwood Manor were part of widespread networks of communication and mutual aid that connected enslaved communities across vast distances. The marriage of Morrison and Celeste has also been re-examined as part of larger patterns of interracial relationships in the antebellum South. While legal marriages between white men and black women were extremely rare, informal relationships were more common than traditional historical accounts had acknowledged. The Morrison case was unusual primarily in its public nature and its violation of social conventions, rather than in the basic fact of sexual relations between enslaved and enslaver. Contemporary scholars have also emphasized the economic dimensions of Morrison's decision to marry Celeste. His willingness to sacrifice his social position and business relationships for the sake of the marriage suggests motivations that went beyond simple sexual attraction or romantic attachment. Some historians have argued that Morrison may have been influenced by abolitionist ideas that were circulating more widely in the Upper South during the 1850s, while others suggest he was responding to psychological pressures created by his awareness of his family's history of violence against enslaved people. The mystery of what exactly happened to Morrison and Celeste remains unsolved, despite more than a century and a half of investigation and speculation. The physical evidence discovered at Ashwood Manor supports the conclusion that both continued to live on the property for some time after the official records cease, but their ultimate fate cannot be determined with certainty. The underground chambers and tunnel system could have provided shelter for extended periods, while the network of supporters among the broader enslaved community would have ensured access to food and other necessities. One theory that has gained credibility among recent scholars suggests that Morrison and Celeste eventually left South Carolina together, using the confusion of the Civil War period to establish new identities in a different region where their history was unknown. This interpretation is supported by evidence of continued habitation at Ashwood Manor during the early 1860s, followed by what appears to be a definitive abandonment sometime during the war years. The couple might have relocated to the north or west, where Morrison's wealth and Celeste's freedom would have allowed them to live openly without the social constraints that had made their situation untenable in South Carolina. Alternative theories focus on the possibility that one or both of them died at Ashwood Manor, either from natural causes or as a result of violence by people opposed to their marriage. The absence of graves or remains might be explained by burial in unmarked locations, disposal of bodies in the nearby river, or concealment in areas of the property that have not yet been thoroughly searched. However, the lack of any contemporary evidence for violence or unnatural death makes these scenarios less plausible than theories involving voluntary departure or continued hiding. The spiritual and cultural dimensions of the Ashwood Manor story continue to resonate with people seeking to understand the complex legacy of slavery in American society. The site has become a place of pilgrimage for some African Americans, who view it as a symbol of resistance and the possibility of triumph over oppression. The combination of documented historical events with persistent folklore and unexplained phenomena creates a powerful emotional connection that transcends academic historical analysis. For scholars of religion and folklore, Ashwood Manor provides a unique opportunity to study the persistence of African spiritual traditions in the American context. The archaeological evidence of ritual activity, combined with oral traditions about ceremonial practices, offers insights into how enslaved people maintained cultural connections to their ancestral homeland while adapting to new environmental and social conditions. The underground chambers and tunnel system represent a physical manifestation of hidden cultural spaces that allowed for the preservation of practices that would have been suppressed if conducted openly. The environmental challenges facing Ashwood Manor in the 21st century add urgency to ongoing research and preservation efforts. Climate change and sea level rise threaten to submerge portions of the site within the next few decades, while increased storm activity accelerates the decay of remaining structures and artifacts. Preservationists face difficult decisions about which aspects of the site to prioritize for protection and how to balance historical preservation with environmental realities. Recent archaeological work has focused on documenting and preserving as much information as possible before rising waters make portions of the site inaccessible. Emergency excavations have uncovered additional artifacts and structural remains, while digital mapping techniques create permanent records of features that may soon be destroyed by flooding. These efforts represent a race against time to preserve the physical evidence of events that continue to shape our understanding of American history. The story of Ashwood Manor ultimately defies simple interpretation or easy moral conclusions. The documented events challenge conventional assumptions about plantation society, slave resistance, and interracial relationships in the antebellum South. While the persistent mysteries surrounding the site invite continued speculation and investigation, the marriage of Morrison and Celeste violated every social convention of their time and place, creating consequences that reverberated through their community for generations. Whether viewed as a tragic love story, a tale of successful resistance, or a supernatural mystery, the case of Ashwood Manor illuminates the complex human dimensions of American slavery and the ways individual actions could disrupt established patterns of domination and subordination. The underground chambers and tunnel system stand as monuments to the determination and ingenuity of people who refuse to accept their subjugation, while the persistent folklore surrounding the site reflects the deep psychological impact of events that challenge the fundamental assumptions of their society. The plantation ruins continue to attract visitors who come seeking answers to questions that may never be fully resolved. The silence that now blankets the property conceals secrets that have resisted more than a century and a half of investigation, reminding us that some aspects of the historical experience remain beyond the reach of documentary evidence or scientific analysis. In the end, Ashwood Manor stands as a testament to the power of human agency to transform even the most oppressive circumstances, and to the enduring mystery of events that exceed our capacity to fully understand or explain them. The morning mist still rises from the ruins where Morrison and Celeste once walked together, defying the conventions that governed their world and creating ripples that continue to spread through time. Their story reminds us that history is shaped not only by the powerful and privileged, but by ordinary people who make extraordinary choices in the face of impossible circumstances. And perhaps, in the silence that now envelops Ashwood Manor, their voices can still be heard, whispering secrets that the past has never quite been ready to reveal.